The early 1970s was an incredibly interesting period of American cinema, as it is really cliche to say. And among the more championed filmmakers from this period was one, Robert Altman, celebrated for his works of cultural assessment, the likes of MASH, Nashville, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, even Brewster McCloud, are attempting to assess sweeping swathes of America's culture, be it the desensitized frat boy pathos which defined the overseas trips to the Korean or Vietnam Wars, the celebration of idiosyncrasy and an insular arrogance, a kind of anti-global American chauvinism within Nashville. McCabe and Mrs. Miller composed a western as a period piece rather than as an exercise within genre land, potentially the definitive revisionist western as a prospective result. Then even Brewster McCloud was a seemingly fond ode to the more isolated and oddball of America's, at that time, younger generations. So then it may be that one is wondering, where did 1973's The Long Goodbye fit in with all of this? On the surface, it appears to be a reverent homage to those old hard-boiled detective features, proudly adapting the iconic writer Raymond Chandler, presumably in an effort to recapture some of the former glory of that rather beloved form. In the cinema prior, 1946's The Big Sleep had been the definitive Chandler adaptation, and also in many people's minds the major iconic work within its identified cinematic genre, or the only other Humphrey Bogart-led detective noir to be cited regularly with 1941's adaptation of Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, iconically directed by the quite legendary John Huston. Chandler, and along with Hammett, were the most commonly identified major authors of the literary mode, and the subsequent film adaptations of their work defined even more so this fictional form within the popular culture. It was an appeal which ought to be obvious to most of us, and it would appear that Altman sought to recapture some of that old fun and enthusiasm for a 1973 work set in the then contemporary, and imagining how Chandler's beloved protagonist Philip Marlowe might handle a case in the supposedly morally shot and quadruply cynical early 70s versus how he might have, or what he might have been initially up against in, say, the 1940s. The appeal of the genre was the cool, suave, mostly down on their luck private detective who is mostly skilled with his wits, but not infallible. He is capable of being tricked, of being duped by some gallant lady, what we usually refer to as the femme fatale, and he spends a notable portion of the film, despite being the pistol-pointing protagonist, being beaten up or interrogated by some ruthless thugs. Rather than the unrealistic displays of action hero bravura, made famous during the 1980s, but also rooted in some new Hollywood items such as Bullet, the film starring Clint Eastwood, certainly the American films. The Man with No Name was beaten up up to near death at least once in all three of those movies. Certain Kill 'Em All World War II movies, Where Eagles Dare, The Great Escape, maybe somewhat, or The Train, the martial arts films of the 1970s, or the adjacent British realised Bond films. Conversely, characters like Phil Marlowe were closer to the average movie-going enthusiast, considering themselves witty, capable of solving a mystery, but not entirely able to win all of the fistfights they find themselves in, unable to just gun down all the baddies, and often as much of a sap and a played tool as they are a suave, envied, slick action chap. This is the appeal of such protagonists, because when it is a tall order to relate with the apparent invincibility of John Rambo, one had Philip Marlowe to then aspire toward, in a more realistic, relatable, and tangible manner. And so perhaps Altman and very legendary screenwriter Lee Brackett, who had helped to pen the screenplay for the 1946 Howard Hawks directed Big Sleep some decades prior, were eager to explore how the 1940s values of Philip Marlowe would counteract with the more allegedly morally great epoch of the earlier 1970s, a cross-section, a collision of worlds within America's or California's, Los Angeles' culture, which would make it a consistent venture within Altman's cultural analyses of the United States peoples during the early 1970s. And yet, 1973's The Long Goodbye is arguably most effective as a simply, thoroughly entertaining, hard-boiled exercise, more so than as a wider commentary of the zeitgeist then emanating out of the US. This isn't to say that these components of the film aren't at all interesting, although I am personally skeptical of the idea that the early 1970s would be so much more slimy and valueless compared with America in the 1940s. The Hollywood Code didn't apply to reality. You can read of plenty of grisly crimes, malignant betrayals, and unprincipled opportunism, moral corruption galore, which took place in the 1940s, so I'm genuinely unsure of why Altman or Brackett may have held the pre-war era in a significantly higher regard, if they even did. Maybe it was intended as a commentary on the shifting nature of what these genre films were permitted to do in their screenplays, Although I have to admit, I find that idea to be less interesting. Navel gazing at Hollywood trends and making this the focus of your film's concept seems a bit dull to me, personally. Like how the Wachowskis' The Matrix was about the nature of our reality and the imprisoning mundanity of the developing world, and then the fourth most recent film was about the lack of original IPs to be found in Hollywood by the start of the 2020s or so. Whatever the case, they, Altman and Brackett, certainly succeeded in composing the most entertaining, watchable, and compositionally impressive of potentially all of the cinematic Chandler adaptations, and whilst I hold in high regard the 46 Big Sleep, as well as the 44 Chandler rendition Murder My Sweet starring Dick Powell, I might find the Altman film to be the most admirable of these. I'm not considering films which Chandler helped to script, such as 44's Double Indemnity or 51 Strangers on a Train from Hitchcock, as they weren't adaptations of his work as such. It is also worth mentioning the Robert Mitchum starring duology, also of the 1970s, of Chandler adaptations Marlowe Works, 1975's Farewell My Lovely, and 1978's identically titled The Long Goodbye, the latter set in England and directed by the interesting fellow Michael Winner, and an intriguing undertaking in my own view, a highly commendable work in of itself. Mitchum may have been too old to play Marlowe compared with the electric, riveting, immensely watchable turn of Elliot Gould, or the classic roles from Bogart or Powell, and yet few will deny that Mitchum is probably one of the most likeable, exciting, and engaging actors in the history of all English-language cinema. As it happens, I find myself sometimes alienated from Altman's films, too American for me, a non-American, an Australian, sick and fed up with American cultural imperialism tainting these shores after so many decades of it. That being said, I loved when Altman directed films that were slightly distinct or separate from what his works are typically focused upon. The aforementioned features such as MASH, Nashville, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or Brewster McCloud, for instance. I think The Long Goodbye is a cracking film experience. I love his Bergman homages in Images, and especially 1977's Free Women, my pick for Altman's best overall film. The peculiar and unpredictable number that is 1979's Quintet, which I highly recommend you all go and see as soon as you get the chance to. And also, as a vague, slightly bitter Anglophile, I find Gosford Park to be quite stellar and a worthwhile application of Altman's talents without being wasted on American self-appreciation or otherwise forced idiosyncrasies. This isn't to say I don't appreciate, in some capacity at least, some works such as McCabe and Mrs. Miller. That film is tremendous, I won't deny that, a highly watchable piece. The overall result of the most famous title, Nashville, despite being highly obnoxious and annoying and vaguely American supremacist in its own way, the idea that this is somehow an apotheosis of cinema, American kookiness, genuinely sickens me to some unusual extent. 84's Secret Honor is a fun watch, especially if you find the pathos of Richard Nixon to be remotely fascinating, and I think that a lot of us, especially raised on sublime Futurama, long after Nixon's terms, rather do, interestingly enough. The player and shortcuts are pretty fun, I won't dispute that either, and I even do like Brewster McCloud, though I've always wished that I would like it more. I suppose I hope it would be closer to De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise or Gilliam's Brazil, but is sooner a haunting prototype to the navel-gazing Hooray Americans fluff, which is his most celebrated work, clearly Nashville. I don't mean to be too harsh on Altman, but compared with the American geniuses of that generation, Coppola, De Palma, Scorsese, Schrader, Friedkin, Spielberg, Peckinpah, Lucas, Malick, maybe Penn as well, or even more underrated figures such as Perry, Rafelson, Hooper, and Hellman, I've always considered Altman's priorities to be for the birds, too easy, too American, too self-interested, and, on the whole, quite painfully inconsistent without much reaping of rewards when he does compose a new classic. The later Altman works didn't make up for all of the mediocrity compared with the occasional spurts of inspiration from Coppola, De Palma, Friedkin, even Scorsese himself. If you're an American and you adore Altman, I can rather understand that. I accept that. I'll gladly agree to disagree. But if you're a non-American, or non-Canadian perhaps, and you revere Altman, honestly, I don't mean to be too harsh, but seriously, do get a life.